Hello and welcome back. So the G7 summit begins on Friday, and this year it is being hosted here in the UK in a five-star hotel in Cornwall on the southwest coast of England. Let's just have a look at why it is such an important meeting. G7 is a group of 7 of the world's largest, most advanced economies, including the UK, which currently holds the presidency of the group. The United States, Canada, Germany, France, Italy and Japan, as well as representatives from the European Union, are attending. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has also invited Australia, India, South Korea and South Africa as guest countries to this year's summit. Main issues on the agenda are the COVID-19 pandemic and post-pandemic recovery, tackling climate change and promoting free and fair trade. Well, all these issues affect the way we live now and the planet we live on, but they also impact the next generation. So how relevant is this gathering of, well, relatively old heads of state to people aged 25 and under? And what do they think should be on the table at the G7 summit? Let's find out now. I am joined by Filipe Conde, who is 23 years old from Sao Paulo in Brazil, who's a PE teacher and scoutmaster. Isabella Origgi from Peru is 25. She co-founded a marine conservation charity. She joins us from Miami in Florida, where she is a vaccine tourist due to the slow rollout in her home country. Twins Asheer and Asees Asheer are 17-year-old climate activists in Delhi who have set up a COVID helpline and a team of volunteers to help provide people with whatever they need, from oxygen to a hospital bed. And finally, Miriam Glustein, who is 22 in Toronto, Canada. She graduated last year and now works for Capital One credit card company. Welcome to you all. We have so much to get through in the next 25 minutes. It's pretty clear that, well, let's start with COVID. We'll come on to climate change in a moment. But when you look at how the pandemic has affected different ages, different demographics, different parts of the world, it is pretty clear that the West and developed nations have done much better than the developing nations. And I want to come to some specifics in a moment. But can I just start actually with Filipe? I just want to hear, in general, how tough the pandemic has been and how it has changed your life, just generally, before we drill down into the specifics.
So let's go. At first, it's a pleasure to me to be here and can talk about all these topics with you guys. And I think I'm gonna talk about my experience here in Brazil, of course. And what I see is the biggest problem. It's hard when we talk about pandemic, choose a topic to be the worst. Of course, every single problem is a problem, and every single person has a problem to face off. But here in Brazil, I think we face off like a lot of problems with education, with basic education. And during the pandemic, the things get in trouble, because before the pandemic, it's already hard here, the things about basic education here in Brazil. And during the pandemic, the people are not prepared to face off online classes. Yeah. We have the reality here. I work as a teacher in a particular school, and there we have internet connection, we have cell phones, we have notebook, laptops. But my sister works as a teacher too, but she works for the state, and they are people who doesn't have like internet connection. In the most part of the time, they doesn't have a cell phone, they doesn't have like a laptop. So this makes the challenge like 1,000 plus bigger. And I think challenge these things, it's becoming like a snowball, a big problem, because if we don't fix the education, it's be hardest to fix another problems.
Yeah, and Isabella, just coming on to you, I mean, so many countries initially, not Brazil, but so many other countries, including Peru, locked down very aggressively to start off with. But now Peru has got one of the highest death rates per capita. What's gone wrong there, and how angry does that make you as a young person who's, still very relatively, you're 25 years old?
Yes, first of all, thank you for the invitation. It's quite an honor to be here. But yeah, the lockdown was very hard for all of us. But let's get something straight. In Peru, there is a wide inequality gap. So there is the very privileged people and the very, very vulnerable people. So this quarantine and the lockdown just intensified this inequality. So yes, I was part of the lucky people that I can work from home. I have internet, I can get food delivered. I live in a, like, everything is quite nearby. But most of my country does not have that privilege. Most of my country's reality is they need to go out and work, and they live on a money income day by day to feed their family and to get by. So they had the need to go out, and most of the businesses were closed. Public transport was clearly impacted. So it was very hard. You could see all of these people going out and the rates of COVID not decreasing. They kept on increasing, and death rates kept on increasing. Even if we had lockdowns, even if we had quarantines, until today, we still have curfews at night. So even though economy has opened a bit, there is still a great impact. And it has not only impacted health, it's impacted the living quality of many, many people in my country.
Exactly, and people need to work, and if there's not the financial support, it is a difficult choice, isn't it? We're going to come to youth unemployment in a moment in a bit more detail, but Asees Asheer, just coming to you, the inequity that we were hearing from Isabella, for example, is even more striking perhaps in India, where the private healthcare system will give a much better service than the public one, but even both systems couldn't cope with the sheer scale of the pandemic there. How has it been for you, though, as, 17-year-old twins? I mean, you've stepped in to help, but how tough has it been for the younger generation like you?
I think it's been really tough, especially the past few months when the second wave hit India. So many people, we've lost so many people. I know people my age and younger who've lost both their parents, their grandparents, their siblings. And I think this is why it was such an emotionally distressing time for the country. Because you can understand if someone dies of COVID, but if you're dying due to lack of oxygen, lack of resources, lack of hospital beds, that's not acceptable. Everyone knew that at some point the second wave was going to hit India, but there was no preparation of any sort to avoid the kind of situation we are in today.
And I just want to come to Asees briefly as well, specifically how it's affected the young. I mean, you are both incredibly young and very dynamic in what you do in terms of your campaigning, and you set up a helpline. What about the young people you're dealing with there?
So like last year, like during the lockdown, we saw that so many people were struggling to make ends meet. And our own house help didn't have enough income to buy basic food, medication, PPE kits. And that is why we, along with a few other students, started the Hunger Helpline to provide basic resources to people who are in need of it. And within a few days, we got so many calls. I remember one of the first calls being of a mother desperately trying to arrange 200 milliliters of milk for her baby. And there are so many like this. The COVID helpline is still running, and I think as we have helped people and as more time went by, we realized that this helpline was not only about food. People are desperate for rehabilitation, employment opportunities, and during the second wave, medical supplies like oxygen and medication. But as students, as citizens, this is all we can do. We need our policy leaders, our government to step in so that we can make changes at a much larger scale as needed right now.
And it'll be interesting to see what Narendra Modi says about this when he dials in, presumably via Zoom or something more secure than that perhaps, for the G7. Just a final thought with you, Miriam. You've graduated, you've started a job. I don't think you've met any of your work colleagues yet, though, have you?
That's correct. Yeah, Canada has been effectively in lockdown for the past 6 months, or at least Ontario has. So I started work 9 months ago, and I have yet to meet any of my colleagues, and that's the case for almost everyone I know who started work during or after the pandemic started.
OK, right, let's look at the rollout of the vaccination programme, for example. Some very big ambitions at the G7, wanting to vaccinate the world and to restore that inequity between the developing world and the developed world. Let's just look through some of the figures, because America has announced that it will donate 500 million coronavirus vaccines for 92 poorer countries in an effort to try and address the global imbalance there in access. President Joe Biden and Boris Johnson are urging the leaders of the other G7 countries to commit to vaccinating the world against COVID-19 by the end of next year. It's worth just reminding what a monumental challenge, though, that will be. Just look at this map here. It shows the number of single vaccine doses administered per 100 people. And just look at that in terms of the black spots on the colours. You can see the US, Canada, Western Europe and China way ahead of Africa, parts of Asia and South America. And that discrepancy is even greater if we just look at the share of the global population that are fully vaccinated against COVID-19. Let's go to Isabella on that, because you are a vaccine tourist, aren't you? What happened with you?
So in Peru, the vaccine situation is very complicated. We've had in the last year and a bit around 4 presidents. So the level of policy and political instability and corruption is quite great, and that has been reflected also in the vaccine situation. So right now with the transition government, we have managed to vaccinate. Right now in July, I think they're going for above 50-year-old people. So we are moving quite fast now thanks to this transition government, but the reality has not been the same throughout the beginning of the year nor through the end of last year. So I am an American. I was born in the States. So I have the luck that I could come to America and get vaccinated, but that is not the situation for the majority of my country. Not even the ones that can afford it. The visa situation has also been complicated. You cannot get visa appointments until the end of the year. So the young people are trying to travel and they are trying to get vaccinated, because I live with my grandma. She's vaccinated, thank God. But we are still a virus carrier. So it is moving slow. It's moving better now. Hopefully now with the new president, this will not stop. Whoever it comes out, we still have no idea who our next president is going to be. We're currently throughout presidential elections. So
I know. Well, you've had 3, haven't you, during the pandemic? Miriam, I just wonder how you feel, though, about, well, teenagers being vaccinated really to protect the older demographic, and whether that is really a risk too far, because you know there are some question marks about whether teenagers and children should be vaccinated.
Well, Canada has started vaccinating everybody above the age of 12. And one of the reasons for that is because we were trying to reopen schools, which have been closed for several months now. So I understand the logic of vaccinating teenagers so that we can reopen schools, since that's one of the things that's preventing us from reopening our economy, since children need childcare. That being said, while Canada's first dose vaccination rate is now very high, our second dose vaccination rate is still very low. So there's a question to be asked about the prioritization of children getting their first doses over older adults getting their second doses.
OK, I want to come to Asees Asheer in a minute, and Filipe, but let's just move on to another issue, because I was explaining that disproportionately unemployment has been a real problem for the youth in today's pandemic. All those jobs that would normally be associated with hospitality and things have been affected. So youth unemployment was, of course, a problem in pre-pandemic times, but young people, as I say, have been especially hard hit by the COVID-19 crisis. There are 1.2 billion people in the world between the ages of 15 and 24. That's 16% of the global population. Now, more than 250 million young adults are officially classified as youth NEET. These young adults are not in employment, education or training. That's what NEET means. And in 2020, young workers' pay fell by 8.3%. Filipe, what happened for you during the pandemic in terms of your training, your work, your job placements, and what you really wanted to do as a career?
Yeah, let's go. Before the pandemic, I'm not used to work as a teacher. I was an athlete, and I play a game, a sport. It's called hockey in a team. But this team, because the pandemic is get closed, so I be part of the young people who lost their jobs because the pandemic. And after this, I have to find another way, find another job. And I find the solution being a teacher, became a teacher. That's why I'm a teacher like since a year ago at the start of the pandemic. But the most part of my friends get without a job lose their houses because they have to pay the rent and have to get back to live with their parents. So it's really hard times here, and I have to do online class, of course, because I teach physical education here in Brazil. And at the beginning it's like really hard because people are not used to have online classes here. I think all around the world the people are used to have like presential classes, but as I said, it's hard times, but we have to find the solution. We have to find how to give classes online, even physical education classes online, turn on my camera and try to do my best to my students.
Asif, I want to come to you first, then Asheer. How concerned are you about your prospects going to university and then what's going to happen to you afterwards in terms of the backlog of people trying to get jobs? And do you think that the G7 leaders should be prioritising your age group now?
Yes, of course. I mean, we are the youth of this country. We are the ones who will lead this country towards the future. And all our plans are very uncertain now because of, the COVID-19 pandemic. And the education system of our country has really suffered quite a bit over the year. We are lucky to come from privileged backgrounds where we go to schools who provide us brilliant online educations and we have access to devices and internet. But most of the country and millions of children are not that lucky. The underprivileged from both urban and rural areas don't have access to internet, and even if they did, they didn't have the devices to attend class. Just imagine a family of 5 people and one device between them. Who is supposed to use it?
Yeah, Asheer?
Just picking up from where she left. The education system has suffered so much and it's especially for India, which is one of the youngest countries of the world right now. Our population is biased towards the youth. Education is so important. And if we're not being provided with enough opportunities, employment, education, it's a waste of great potential, especially since the COVID pandemic has thrown our economy for a toss. However, how do we expect to rejuvenate the economy, to rehabilitate the country if you cannot provide the youth, the soon-to-be working class, with sufficient education? It's going to be impossible, just going to get harder and harder through the years.
OK, I want to just turn to the other one of the other major issues of this G7 this coming weekend, and that's going to be climate change, one of the major issues of the agenda, as I say, for the G7 leaders. We can expect many more pledges this time. The summit closes on Sunday. Well, let's just look at where the G7 nations stand at the moment on climate change. Just last month, they agreed to make accelerated efforts to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade. That's a major shift from previous statements that focused on limiting warming to 2 degrees. They also want to stop direct funding of coal-fired power stations in poorer nations by the end of 2021 and conserve or protect at least 30% of land and at least 30% of the world's oceans by 2030. And all G7 countries are committed to reaching net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, part of the 2015 Paris Agreement, which the US has now signed up to again. But are those promises enough? Let's go back to Isabella. Do you want them to be more ambitious and actually to build in some sort of penalties if they don't meet those ambitions?
I think, honestly, they need to do their bit. They are the biggest nations, the biggest polluters as well. And I hadn't come to the States in 10 years. And when I come, they're still using disposables, like disposable Technipore plates and cups. And they're using bags. Every time you go to a store, they give you plastic bags. We don't do that in Peru. We have a penalty for that. We are eliminating single-use plastic, and it's Peru. How is it that the States, with more resources, more technology, more power, and more pollution, still hasn't enforced that? It's stuff like that that makes us think that if they don't have penalties, will they really do it? Will they really agree and go through with what they promise? And at least in Peru, they promised to protect 20% of the oceans by 2020. It's 2021. We are still protecting 0.8% of our oceans.
Miriam, they're trying to set a good example, aren't they? I'm told that the G7 this year is carbon neutral. They will not use, it'll be plastic free where possible, and everything will be recycled as well. But I just look at the figures. I was looking at this earlier on. If you look at the G7 economies and the financial indexes, in terms of the main businesses of the G7, they're nowhere near the targets that they claim to be at the moment.
Yeah, that's absolutely true, and it's definitely true for Canada as a nation as well. We still have a very heavy reliance on fossil fuels for power and electricity.
Although that pipeline's been abandoned, that must be good news for you.
It is absolutely good news for me. But as you know, it wasn't abandoned by our government. It was abandoned by the United States. So it's not a good sign that our government is doing what they can to stop climate change when they're trying to build a pipeline, even in this current environment.
Filipe, what do you think should be on the agenda? Is it ambitious enough for you and your generation? I mean, you're in Brazil, and when you look at what's happening to the rainforest there, I mean, nothing seems to stop the eradication of that at the moment.
Yeah, for sure is another problem we have to face off here in Brazil. We have a leader, we have a president who doesn't care too much for like any big problem around the world. He didn't care about the vaccine, he didn't care about ecological things. And the things get hardest here, but a way I think about this climate change and ecological problems, and I learned this in the Scout movement, when we face off a big problem, we have to start to small solutions, because if we start to local solution, once this, if we had a lot of local solution and a lot of people thinking together, we can solve this big problem. We have to think globally, but act locally. That's what we learn in the Scouting. And the math for me is simple. If everybody around the world think like that and start to do your part, we can solve the most part of the problems.
Asees and Asees, I'll start with you if I may. I think the G7 governments are pledging $100 billion for climate change, but at the moment I think they've only sort of pledged about $36 billion. What about debt relief? I mean, how important is that for a country like India and other countries in a similar position?
I feel that all debts of the countries in the global south need to be cancelled, because the economy is already suffering so much, and we live on the ground. We see the repercussions of all these decisions being made by the leaders, and people are actually suffering right now. They need to invest all their money, all their resources right now in rehabilitating the country. Then they need to focus on employment. They need to focus on providing rations and economic packages to people who do not have access to even the most basic necessities. We have seen so many families going without days, without food, and they don't even have basic necessities right now.
Asees?
And and the G7 summit has real potential for change, but the G7 governments need to stop fueling the climate crisis with continued support for fossil fuel, including fossil fuel production and consumption in the global south. And most importantly, these international agreements need to translate into domestic law. You can sign all the agreements and policies as you'd like, but unless they are being implemented, they have no consequence. I want our leaders to follow through with their promises. Yeah, we've heard so much in the last 4 or 5 years about all these ambitious goals they've set and targets they aim to reach, but there is nothing that's happening on ground. We cannot see the action, and action is what counts. You can make all the promises, you can say all the words, but you need to do something about it. These agreements don't actually translate to anything when it comes down to the countries. You were mentioning right now about carbon neutrality at the summit. Okay, it's neutral, but what happens when these leaders go back to their own countries? Are they going to ban single-use plastic? Are they going to take large steps? Because these are the people who have the power to make an impact. It's not a consumer problem. We individuals, it's not a consumer problem. It is a producer problem in the end.
Okay. Okay, and the oceans, of course, you know, we've got World Oceans Day and to try and by 2030 in terms of affecting the oceans. We've only got a minute or so left. Miriam, if you could have a sit down with Pierre Trudeau, what would you say to him this weekend?
I would say that he needs to start focusing on how we're going to recover from the COVID-19 pandemic, and that's both in terms of creating opportunities for employment for youth and creating opportunities for youth to get the skills they need to succeed in the new workforce. And it's also to get serious about climate change and focus on shifting our energy supply from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources in a sustainable way.
OK, I've got time just for one more. Isabella, what would you say if you could, and to whom?
I would ask them to do their part. Climate change is going to happen. It is not a green trend, but we need to take action. And they have the resources, as everyone here has said, they have the power. They need to start implementing change and actually taking action and making laws, enforcing laws.
OK, do you know, I'm sorry, I'm going to cut you off there. We've been speaking for about 25 minutes, guys. Really good to speak to you. Filipe, Isabella, Asees Asheer and Miriam, thank you very much indeed for joining us here on BBC News for your views of the upcoming G7.